Hi, y'all. It's Barbara from Divine Creative Love. Today we'll be painting a watercolor rainbow inspired by the story of Noah's Ark. In Genesis 9, God sets the rainbow in the sky as a sign of his covenant, a lasting promise to his people. So come paint with me and let's reflect on his faithfulness together. I'm doing this page in my NLT journaling Bible, and you'll notice I've already prepped the page with gesso because the paper is quite thin, and I'll use that deli paper behind the page to protect the adjacent pages. And if you want to see the process of how to do this, I did a whole tutorial on how to prep your page with gesso that I'll link to up above and in the description below. And then I'm also propping up the Bible with a little pocket Bible behind it because we're in Genesis and there's not much kind of padding or cushion, in the front of the Bible. And for my watercolor set, I'm using the Paul Rubens metallic watercolors. It comes with all these pretty colors, so I've got lots of options. But you can use whatever kind of watercolors you have on hand, any even if it's Crayola watercolors or if it's, professional watercolors, just whatever you want to use. Any watercolors will do. And I'm going to speed up the video at this point. The whole process took me about an hour to complete. And I'm starting with a cloud stamp because I wanted to have a cloud that was alongside the rainbow. And then to create my little rainbow template, I just folded a piece of cardstock in half and then cut that arch. And for the cloud, I'm using archival ink because it's waterproof, and that way the watercolor paint won't make the stamp ink bleed. So archival ink is very handy if you're using it alongside any kind of paint that's going to potentially make the ink run. And it's always important to clean the stamps. Especially with archival ink, it's more prone to staining. So with that, I use just a wipe to clean it, and then they have this archival ink cleaner that they sell that you can use to get more of the ink off. And then again, to create this rainbow template, I just took a piece of cardstock paper and folded it in half and then cut that arch, just kind of freehanded it. And then I'm just tracing it with pencil to create the whole width of the rainbow. And I wasn't trying to be super exact. I thought about measuring, but I decided against it and just kind of freehanded it, just creating the overall width of the rainbow. And then there's usually 7 traditional colors in the rainbow, so I divided it kind of up into 7 parts and kind of tried to even out each section so each color would get a relatively equal amount of space within the rainbow. And then I just drew in pencil each line so I'd know where to put each color. And it's worth noting I decided to only do like half of the rainbow arch for this page. I really didn't want to cram like a whole rainbow onto one small page, but you could put a whole rainbow on one page if you wanted to, like a small rainbow, or you could even extend the rainbow onto 2 pages. And then I didn't want the lines to show up as much, so I went in with my eraser and just lightened the pencil lines a little bit. I love this Vanish eraser. It works really good and doesn't leave much residue behind. And now it's time to start painting our rainbow. So when I was a kid, they taught us to remember the colors of the rainbow by the Roy G. Biv acronym, which stands for red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. So it makes an easy way to remember what order all the 7 colors of the rainbow go in. So I used my little watercolor guide to pick out which shades of the different colors I wanted to use. And I decided to go just left to right, starting with the red and ending with the violet on the right side. And I used a really thin liner brush to color each color of the rainbow, so that way it's easy to color in that thin line and to not overlap too much. And the trick to painting with watercolors is always how much water versus paint to include. like how many drops of water I added to the palette to to activate the watercolor. And then if you add more water, then you're going to end up with like more runny watercolor that's less saturated. Or if you add less, then you'll end up with thicker watercolor paint that's more saturated. And it depends on what your goal is. In the case of Bible journaling, you don't want to make it too watery though, because you don't want to run or like, dribble on the page. So I used a pretty happy medium between just a little bit of water, but not too much. And then you'll notice in between each color, I went back with a clean brush and kind of blended in between the colors to make it each color blend a little bit into the next one. And this is where it's very handy to have the paper towel and some scrap paper close by, just to blend off some of the excess water and make sure that the brush is clean in between the colors. And that's actually one of the things that I really like about watercolors, is that it's easy to switch between colors because the pigment is not very heavy, and it's easy to just swish it in the water and then dry it off on the paper towel and just go to the next color, and a lot less time than it would be to switch between like acrylic paint colors. And while we continue to paint the rainbow, let's talk a little bit about the part of Noah's story where God puts the rainbow in the clouds. Genesis chapter 9 verses 12 through 15 says, "Then God said, I am giving you a sign of my covenant with you and with all living creatures for all generations to come. I have placed my rainbow in the clouds. It is the sign of my covenant with you and with all the earth. When I send clouds over the earth, the rainbow will appear in the clouds, and I will remember my covenant with you and with all living creatures. Never again will the floodwaters destroy all life." And notice how in verse 12, God specifically said, "for all generations to come." So this wasn't just a promise for the present generation, it was for everyone, even all the way up to us in the present time. That's why every time I see a rainbow, I think of God's promises, and it always seems to happen at a significant time too, like when I really needed to see it. Literally, after I finished this page, I went out for a walk later that afternoon, and the sun was setting, and there was a little tiny hint of a rainbow that reflected off of the sun in the clouds, and I thought that was so cool. I don't know if I've ever really noticed that happening before outside of a rainstorm, but it was definitely there, and it was definitely like a God wink thing. I think sometimes when life gets hard, it can feel like being in the middle of a ocean in a boat, where it's raining for 40 days and 40 nights, like Noah's experience. It feels like the storms are going on, and we don't know where God is or like what his plan is, why he's, allowing certain things to happen. But it's things like the rainbow that remind us that God is still faithful and he still has a plan. He's still with us always. So I love that even now, a rainbow is still a reminder of God's sovereignty and his promises and the hope that we have in him. And you'll notice here, I went back over the green and the yellow with a little bit more pigment. They just weren't as saturated as I wanted, so I just added a little bit more of each. And then a little bit later, I'm going to go back and blend a little bit more. But the next step is to color in the little cloud. So I used the black watercolor for that. And at first, the color was a little too saturated. You'll see right here, it was like really dark gray. So I decided to add a few more drops of water to it. And that worked out a little bit better to get a lighter gray. And just painted in the cloud with that same liner brush that I used for the rainbow. And then, like I mentioned earlier, I did have to go back in and blend or smooth out some of the color because that green kind of bled a little bit into the yellow. So sometimes with the watercolors, it can be tricky to keep them from bleeding one color into the next if there's too much water. And then I just made sure that it was really good and dry before moving on to the next step, which is to create a sky background. And for that, I decided to bring in my gelatos, this light blue color seemed like a perfect match for the sky color. So I wanted something that was really, really pale light and not gonna compete with the rainbow. So I watered it down really good. That way it's a nice, very, very pale blue sky color that's not competing with the rainbow. And it's worth noting I could have used gelatos for the rainbow, because gelatos make such great watercolors when you mix them with water, but they are kind of more transparent than typical watercolors. So I wanted something more saturated, which is why I used those metallic watercolors. But technically you can use the gelatos for both the rainbow and the background. And you can see I'm carefully painting around the rainbow and the clouds so I don't smudge anything. And actually, you wouldn't have to do the sky background with watercolors as well. You could do the rainbow in watercolor and then use colored pencils for the background if you like. So it doesn't have to be, the whole page done in watercolors. And oh my gosh, you can see the drips happening on my little palette there that I didn't notice until right here. I was like, oh no, I gotta wipe that up. That could have been disastrous and made a mess. Thankfully it didn't run off the palette. So now that our rainbow is done, the only thing left to do is to take some notes. So I gave it a once over with the heat tool to make sure the page was good and dry. And then I've got my Pigma Micron pen that I'm using to write, and I just wrote at the top lessons from Noah's life. Did it in kind of just an easy script, and then I'm going back in to darken some of the downstrokes on the letters just to emphasize them a little bit more. And it just occurred to me I've never gotten into depth about how to do hand lettering in Bible journaling. So if that's something you want me to make a whole video tutorial on, please do let me know in the comments, and I could definitely do that in the future. Because there's so many different hand lettering that you could get into. I don't always do a lot of detailed hand lettering. Like this is just pretty freehanding, easy stuff. But totally let me know if that's something that you're interested in learning more about how to do. So anyway, there are so many great lessons to be gleaned from Noah's life. And so I came up with just a few that stood out to me that I wanted to write down. The first of which is to trust God and do what he says, even if it doesn't make sense, because sometimes it might sound a little crazy, like building a big, huge ark. And but Noah, he was obedient anyway. The second thing is you don't have to be perfect to be used by God for his kingdom. Noah was faithful and obedient, and I'm sure he wasn't perfect, but he was obedient. And the third thing that I wrote down was, when the storms seem to rage on forever, keep trusting God. Can you imagine how a long time it was, 40 days and 40 nights of constant rain, and then another 150 days of waiting for the floodwaters to recede? I'm sure Noah and his family were a little stir crazy and wondering when it was all going to be coming to an end. And the next thing that I wrote was, be persistent in belief, hope, and action, and don't give up. Like Noah sending out the dove to see if the flood waters had receded yet, and he sent the dove out again and again a week later, and eventually got the answer that the floodwaters had receded. And then the last thing that I wrote was, every time you see a rainbow, let it remind you of God's great mercy and his promises. Now that that's all done, I'm just removing all the protective paper and the tape so you can see the finished page. I always use the same removable double-sided adhesive, so it comes off really easily. And I just love how that rainbow turned out. It's the metallics, I think, make it stand out even more than regular watercolors would have. So I'm really glad that I used those. And there's just so many great lessons that I hope to remember about Noah's life and how faithful and obedient he was to God. And I'm curious, what lessons would you glean from Noah's life? Feel free to share them in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure and hit the like button and subscribe to my channel so you won't miss any of my future videos. We'll see you next time. Bye.